Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s foreign policy debate, Averting Conflict in the Caucasus. Is Russia a partner or a spoiler? I'm Heidi Shoup, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here. We are pleased to have as our co-sponsor the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and we are here at the Kennedy Auditorium on the SAIS campus in Washington, D.C. Few parts of the world have so many sources of tension and potential conflict as do the Caucasus. Corruption, suppression of media and political opposition, and human rights concerns add to internal pressures affecting regional tensions. Should the U.S. work closely with Russia to resolve these tensions? We are honored to have with us to debate and discuss this matter two gentlemen well equipped to address the subject, the Honorable John Evans and the Honorable Richard Kozlerich. They will both be introduced formally by our debate moderator, herself well-versed in this area of the world, Dr. Molly O'Neill. Dr. O'Neill has over 3 decades of experience in international affairs, having served in various sectors at the Department of State. Her assignments included Deputy Economic Counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Uzbekistan. She recently completed a PhD in international relations with a focus on Russian and Eurasian politics from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, so she is on home territory this evening. She currently teaches comparative regional studies at the American University School of International Service. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Molly O'Neill and our distinguished speakers.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. The topic of today's discussion is the Caucasus region, which writ large encompasses both the Russian North Caucasus and the 3 countries of the South Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Our particular focus this evening is the role of Russia relative to the issues and problems facing the South Caucasus. By way of background, it is worth remembering that the relationship of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan to their immense northern neighbor reaches back to their incorporation into the Tsarist Empire beginning in the late 18th century and proceeds through the Soviet period with a brief interim of independence in 1917-1918. Historically, the entire Caucasus region occupies a geopolitical and civilizational fault line between the Christian North and the Muslim South, modern Turkey and Iran. The Caucasus region, writ large, extends from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea and is separated into north and south subregions by the Caucasus Mountains. The Russian North Caucasus reaches from the Krasnodar region on the Black Sea coast to Dagestan on the Caspian coast through the mountainous autonomous republics of the small North Caucasian peoples. With the exception of the Christian Ossetians, the indigenous peoples of the Russian North Caucasus are Muslim. Since the establishment of an uneasy peace in Chechnya over the last several years, Moscow has poured large sums of money into reconstruction in the volatile North Caucasus region. Nevertheless, as we all know, terrorist incidents persist in the North Caucasus and occasionally in Moscow itself. It's worth remembering that in 2014, the Winter Olympics are to be held in the Black Sea resort of Sochi, adjacent to some of the North Caucasus republics, which poses security challenges for the organizers. When the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, many feared the emergence of Yugoslav-style wars of succession among and within the newly independent countries. Nothing, happily, on that scale ever happened, but a scenario reminiscent of Yugoslavia did play out tragically in the South Caucasus and in 2 wars in Chechnya in the 1990s. Azerbaijan's Nagorno-Karabakh region, inhabited mainly by ethnic Armenians, was the first of these secessionist wars in the South Caucasus, followed by conflicts in the Georgian provinces of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These three conflicts have entered the diplomatic lexicon as frozen conflicts. However, as we saw in the military confrontation between Russia and Georgia over South Ossetia in August 2008, the potential for resumed fighting around these unresolved secessionist conflicts is very real. In recent months, there have been worrying signs of the potential for resumed conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia related to Nagorno-Karabakh. Secretary Clinton flagged this concern in her recent visit to the South Caucasus countries. Another significant source of tension between Russia, the Caucasus countries, and the United States is the question of oil and gas pipeline routes from Azerbaijan and the broader Caspian region. The U.S. and EU have encouraged the development of export infrastructure from the Caspian shelf of Azerbaijan, transporting oil and gas directly westward across Georgia to the Black Sea or southward to Turkey's Mediterranean port of Ceyhan. Since Russia itself is a littoral state of the Caspian Sea with its own oil and gas resources in the region, Russia is of necessity a player in this aspect of Caucasus diplomacy. We are very lucky to have with us tonight for this debate or discussion two distinguished former ambassadors with deep experience of the Caucasus region and the formulation of U.S. policy toward Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan since the three countries emerged from the USSR in 1991. Ambassador John Evans, here on my left, served as U.S. Ambassador to Armenia from 2004 to 2006. He studied Russian history at Yale and Columbia before joining the Foreign Service and serving in Iran, Czechoslovakia, and USSR, as well as in the office of Secretary Cyrus Vance and on the Soviet desk at the State Department. He then served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Prague, Consul General in St. Petersburg, and headed the OSCE mission to Moldova. He directed the State Department Office of Analysis for Russia and Eurasia and also the department's Office of Russian Affairs. He's now a private consultant. Ambassador Richard Kozlovich's foreign service career included serving as U.S. Ambassador to Azerbaijan in 1994 to 1997, to Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1997-1998. He also served before that as Senior Deputy to the Special Representative for the newly independent states, that was what we called the former Soviet Union at the time, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of European Affairs, where he was responsible for economic relations with the countries then emerging from the Soviet Union. He also held senior positions in the International Organizations Bureau at the State Department on the policy planning staff and as director of the Operations Center, where actually I worked for him a long time ago. Since leaving the Foreign Service, Ambassador Kozlovich has served as National Intelligence Officer for Europe at the National Intelligence Council and is currently the Deputy Director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University's School of Public Policy. I would like to invite now our distinguished guests, each of them in turn, to give their opening presentation on our theme of averting conflict in the Caucasus. Is Russia a partner or a spoiler? So with that, who would like to?
I'll start.
Okay.
Thank you, Molly. I don't blame anybody who's a little confused about the geography. I wish we had a big map here, and the more so for our television audience. Even Henry Kissinger once admitted that he didn't know where South Ossetia was. Well, in Kissinger's time, the United States dealt with the Soviet Union, and it wasn't important for us to know about little places like South Ossetia. Now it is. And even today in the New York Times, there was an article about the tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Just to back up for a minute, though, and think about language. The very title of this talk seems to me to be, shall we say, laden with an expectation. We're talking about whether Russia is a partner or a spoiler. Now, that word spoiler is very value-laden. And so had I been present at the crafting of the title, I might have put it differently, because I think that the choice is not so dire and black and white as that. We have, first of all, the Russian Federation today is not the Soviet Union of yore. There are some similarities, there are some characteristics that are shared by both, But for those of us who served first in the Soviet capital, and then as I did later in St. Petersburg, these are two very, very different countries. And we can see this in their international behavior. So I think the choice laid out here is perhaps too stark. I will be definitely arguing for working with Russia where we can. And of course, I was U.S. ambassador in Armenia, which was a place where very quickly I was able to agree with the Russian ambassador that what we wanted for Armenia, our goals in Armenia, were very similar, not essentially in conflict. And the fact that the United States, Russia, and France have for several years now, almost 20 years now, worked very closely together trying to solve the Armenian-Azeri conflict, I think is testimony to the fact that in that part of the South Caucasus, there are no major misalignments of our interests. Now, if you look at Georgia, it's a different story entirely. And most of you, the people here, remember the August 2008 5-day war that took place then, which came as a great shock to people who thought of these conflicts as frozen. There's another place I want to stop and think about how we use words. Molly, you mentioned that the word frozen had entered the lexicon. It did indeed, and yet many people would say that it's a wrong concept. And part of the reason we were so surprised in August 2008 is because here was something that we thought was frozen, and all of a sudden it wasn't frozen at all. And I would argue that really the four major conflicts that we talk about in the former Soviet Union, Transnistria in Moldova, Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, and Nagorno-Karabakh are really not frozen conflicts. They are a continuing conflict. You know, the Soviet Union formally ended in a legal sense in 1991, but the process of the unraveling of the Soviet Union has continued, not always visibly, especially to the American public, which has so many other things to think about. But in the North Caucasus and in the South Caucasus, this process has continued. And although it's not on our agenda tonight, you can point at other parts of the former Soviet Union that are also, in a historical sense, still evolving towards some future state that we don't know about yet. I'll try to wrap up here, but just to say that while we're not going to talk tonight about the larger world, we're not going to talk about Russia and Syria or these other things, we do have to keep in mind that great powers, and Russia, though not any longer a superpower as was the Soviet Union, Russia is still a very important power. Russia and the United States together have about 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world today. So that is still a major factor. Russia is a player in many, many areas, and I think I would wrap up my initial presentation here by saying, though we cannot always be a full partner with Russia in every circumstance. Russia has her own interests. We have our interests, which are sometimes quite different. Nonetheless, we should not discard the idea of partnership, particularly in those areas where Russia brings a great deal of knowledge and experience to bear, along with her own interests. But we should not assume that Russia is a spoiler, and I would say that rather than using that term, we should say something like a competitor. Thank you.
I want to take the opportunity to thank the World Affairs Council and Johns Hopkins University for hosting this, and I think, Molly, thank you for being here. Your investment in your education here has paid off in making this venue possible. Like John, I'm a bit uncomfortable with parts of this because if I were in a true debate with John, I would preemptively capitulate just because of his experience in the Soviet Union, Russia, and in the region as well. But I think it's an opportunity to have a conversation. And you know, accepting his point about the role of spoiler, there is a need, I think, to look at Russia's role in the region in a nuanced way. And I hope we'll have an opportunity, too, to engage you in this conversation as well. I'd like to start by just saying a few words about where we've been and where we're going, with a particular focus on Russia in this region. It's hard to, for me at least personally, to believe that it's been 20 years that these countries have been independent and the U.S. has had diplomatic relations. It seems like yesterday in many respects. And while this program is not about the U.S. policy in this region, nonetheless, it actually has been quite successful. So we should take a little comfort in that the place is a better place, despite the war in 2008 in Georgia, than it was back when these countries first became independent. Our initial approach to the region was really based on naive hope and practical uncertainty. We really did, I think, as a policy matter, have the hope that Russia and the United States could cooperate to address regional as well as global issues as true partners. This, unfortunately, did not turn out to be the case. But that was our objective going in, I think, to that relationship once the Soviet Union broke up. The practical uncertainty came from the perspective of the U.S. State Department, who really wasn't confident that these states were going to survive more than a couple years. And so when we set up embassies, and Bill Courtney in the audience can remember that very well, this special embassy program, which was Embassy Light, because we didn't want to put a lot of money into embassies in countries that maybe wouldn't exist in a very short period of time. I would add to that the Russians also were not confident that these countries would survive. You had a Russian ambassador counterpart when you were ambassador in Armenia. I didn't when I came to Azerbaijan in 1994, because the Russians didn't have an embassy there for the first 2 years of independence. Look, the U.S., made a lot of mistakes. We didn't take Russian interests in the region seriously. I don't think we understood at the time, and don't necessarily understand now, where the North Caucasus fits into this, as Molly set this issue up. I think we made a mistake with the Freedom Sport Act, which limited the influence that the United States could have in the region. And we left the perception among certain people in the region that the United States would provide a security umbrella beyond what we could actually provide in the event, thinking particularly of the war in Georgia in 2008. Russia made its own mistakes, and one of them was never, to this point at least, except in the most narrowest judicial sense, recognizing these countries, these nations, as fully independent and sovereign. So that's kind of the past. And as I look at the future, I think that it's rather cloudy for a number of reasons that are actually quite different than those that characterize the situation when these countries became independent. Whether we call them frozen or how we term the conflicts, they have become not the open fighting that was involved in the early days, but now conflicts for which there is no war, no peace. And U.S. diplomacy and the Minsk Group diplomacy has not been enough. And certainly with Nagorno-Karabakh, the parties to the conflict are quite happy with whatever we call this situation. The second observation I would make going forward is that U.S.-Russian relations really have not been reset as they relate to this region. Our interests are far more complex and therefore conflictual with Russia, particularly as they relate to Georgia, and also as they relate to Iran's role in the region. The energy situation is changing before our eyes. What were U.S. interests in developing Caspian energy in 1994 no longer apply in a world where non-conventional gas and oil resources have had a profound impact on the supply situation. The demand situation is not from Europe with its economic problems, but from the East. And that puts a totally different perspective on the issue. I also worry that as we approach our own presidential season, that U.S. presidential politics may be immersed in problems relating to the South Caucasus. The Armenian genocide issue, support for Georgia, the reset with Russia, all of these things could have unintended consequences for what we're trying to do in the Caucasus through our diplomatic efforts. So I think going forward, whether Russia's a spoiler or not, we really need to be focused not so much on trying to get the Russians to help us in achieving our objectives in the region, but to clearly understand what our objectives are, be realistic about what the Russians are willing to do, and recognize that Moscow has its own interests, which are not ours, and will pursue them. And we're unlikely to see the kind of cooperation that we would like to see across a whole range of issues. They will not cooperate with us on energy. They probably will not cooperate on peace in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think it's important when we talk about that question to distinguish between conflict and achieving peace, because the Russians are probably quite good partners with the U.S. and others in preventing conflict from emerging. I don't think they're good partners in trying to reach a peaceful settlement of the Nagorno-Karabakh situation. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll get into it in more detail.
Molly, I wonder if we can, before we go to the questions you may have, I wonder if we can continue this discussion a little bit, and particularly on the question of two questions that I think we can try to tease out. One is to define more precisely what we think Russia's interests are. I think that would be useful. And then I think we also need to talk about the Minsk group process on Karabakh. There's just been a meeting on the margins of the, there were two things. There was a statement that emerged on the margins of the G20 from the presidents of the three countries, France, Russia, and the United States, and there was also a meeting in Paris of representatives of the two sides plus the mediators. So it is very much a topic of current interest and concern, I must say. First, on Russia's interests in the Caucasus, in the South Caucasus, because as you rightly said, Molly, this area includes also the North Caucasus, and that leads me to this point, or at least hypothesis, that much of Russia's interest in the South Caucasus is related directly to the North Caucasus, which is part of Russian territory. And there are interactions, despite the fact that this range contains the highest mountain peak in Europe. Nonetheless, there are clear interactions. I mean, after all, they were all in the Soviet Union before, and when the Soviet Union started to come apart, some of these interactions became more noticeable. I mean, the one that is perhaps most famous because of the similarity of name is North Ossetia and South Ossetia, although I think one should not overestimate the degree to which sharing that name makes the people of the North and the South one group. There are lots of differences there. But of course, this North Caucasus area really came to the attention of the West primarily because of the struggle in the early 90s of the Chechens. The Chechens being a Muslim nation who had been deported by Stalin. Let's remember also that Stalin was a Georgian and may have had
Who lived in Baku.
Who lived in Baku. I mean, we can't get away from the nationality business, and he also studied to be a priest at one point. But back to my main point, I do think that unlike us, I mean, if Henry Kissinger doesn't know where South Ossetia is, he does now, but the Russians definitely know that. They know it from the 19th century history of conquest of the region, the Russian literature that is based on the Tolstoy and others who wrote about those days. And the Caucasus has come back with a vengeance in the late 20th century and early 21st. And I can't imagine that Moscow doesn't see these problems as intimately interrelated, and this is without even mentioning Dagestan, which seems to be where a lot of the current tension is. Now, on Karabakh, Rich, you have said that you think Russia might be a good partner for keeping the peace, but not necessarily for making the peace. That remains to be seen. We're nowhere near making peace, but I would recall the very strenuous efforts made by President Medvedev over the last, his term in office, to try to bring the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan to some kind of an agreement. Now, I don't think this was staged for show. I think there was real effort put into it. The closest they came was at Kazan, and that meeting, of course, did not produce agreement. But I think there's another thing we have to keep in mind. The great powers can nudge and push and pressure, but basically the people on the ground have to make the decision for peace. And I do not believe that the two sides, and particularly the two publics in Armenia and Azerbaijan, are ready yet for what we would call a peace agreement. There is, of course, a ceasefire dating back to 1994. It has not been holding all that well recently. There have been multiple violations of it, and that's what has in part given rise to the current serious concern about whether this conflict might again turn violent. One last point on this. I do think that keeping the peace and moving, however slowly, towards a final agreement that everybody can live with is essential. And that goal, while pursuing the goal of a real peace, signed, sealed, and delivered, in the meantime, there is a very important subordinate goal of trying to move forward so that it doesn't go the other direction. So I don't think the Minsk group can be said to have failed in that secondary goal. It may not have achieved the primary goal.
My first question actually was going to be about this very question, and I think I would be interested in following up also on what both of you said, in particular, though, what Ambassador Kozlovich said about Russia's position in the attempts to mediate and find a resolution for the Nagorno-Karabakh problem. And in particular, in addition to answering what Ambassador Evans has said, I'd be curious if you could, either of you, have any kind of insights into what precisely is driving or has driven the Russian position toward the resolution of the conflict. I presume that Russia would not be equidistant from both parties, perhaps closer to the Armenian position. I mean, it might be perceived as such. Also, what level of importance or urgency do you see the Russians giving to the resolution of the conflict? And is there any way that the U.S. could have any influence upon that kind of calculation by the Russians?
This is a point that, you can disagree on and not really sort of come to a conclusion one way or another. But let's at least consider this difference from what John said. Russia has absolutely no interest to have the Nagorno-Karabakh no peace, no war situation turn into open conflict again. Remember, they were the ones who, in 1994, made the first ceasefire happen. It wasn't the U.S., it wasn't the OSCE. The Russians determined, for their own reasons, that enough is enough. And so they stopped the fighting. So I think Russia has more of an ability than any other external party to influence both Armenians and Azerbaijanis, especially if it comes to the potential for going back to war. The tragic loss of life that's occurred in the last couple of weeks along the line of contact is to be regretted. The timing was horrible with Secretary Clinton in the region, supposedly to talk about this very thing. But I don't have the same sense of imminence of war breaking out that some people have. And I could be proven wrong tomorrow, because what's going to set conflict off is not going to be the predictable, it's going to be the unpredictable and the unanticipated. But I just don't see that as happening. If it did, I think it would probably take 24 hours for Russia to intervene somehow to stop the fighting, because it advances no Russian interest for that to happen. Now, I do not see the same degree of commitment on the part of Russian policy, and this has been consistent. Go back to Yeltsin and work your way through to achieve peace. Because let's have our great world where Armenians and Azerbaijanis reach a peaceful settlement on Nagorno-Karabakh, have a normal relationship, economic and political. Turkey opens its borders with Armenia, and everybody lives happily ever after. Russia has no leverage in that situation, political, economic. They do have leverage in the situation where there is no war and there's no peace, because they can work with both Yerevan and Baku, keeping this Minsk group process going, but not reaching a final conclusion. I guess from my seat in Baku, and this was 94 to 97, I really didn't see that much of a direct connection between what was going on in the North Caucasus, particularly first Chechen war at that time, and what was going on with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh. But that was just my own perspective. I think Russia's interests are maintaining their influence in the region. That's what this is their near abroad. And they have interests in the region that go far beyond our interests. And so they're going to pursue protecting that. And the way they do that is by maintaining their leverage. And the current situation allows them to maintain that leverage. What's driving the Russian position on this? National interest, pure and simple. They have no interest in sort of achieving peace for peace's sake, but they do have an interest in advancing their own goals in the region. So it makes them a very, very difficult partner, not someone you'd want to throw out of the Minsk group or not work with, but just simply a partner that you have to recognize that they have very specific ideas that they want to advance, and they aren't necessarily the ideas of the U.S., France, or others in the Minsk group.
Do you have a reaction to that?
Well, simply to say that I think that with all the problems Russia has faced in the North Caucasus, and this brings to mind, Molly, what you mentioned about the Sochi Olympics coming up, the last thing Russia wants is a meltdown in the South Caucasus. Now, that may not be a positive goal, it may be a sort of a negative goal, but I still think it is an interest. And I also think that Russia, by virtue of the size of its economy and location and historical and even family ties and so on, is always going to have leverage in the South Caucasus. And I don't think its leverage would disappear in a situation that were quite a bit more stable. Let's not say this perfect world that you described as a kind of a technique for thinking about it. So I really believe that the Russians have enough problems, and when you think of not just the North Caucasus, but you think of the vast expanse of Russia, I think the last thing they want is instability, and we certainly want stability. We think stability is essential for economic growth and the growth of democratic institutions.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and raise the issue of Georgia, because it seems that this is an area where it would be difficult to conceive, I think, of finding a new cooperative diplomatic track with Russia with respect to the resolution of those two conflicts, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Because before the August 2008 war, Russian diplomacy, at least in a formal sense, had recognized the goal of restoring Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity, so in other words, sovereignty in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, albeit with strong local autonomy for the Abkhaz and Ossetian majorities in these territories. In view of Russia's abandonment of that former policy, and its decision subsequent to the war in 2008 to formally recognize the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, do you see any avenue for bringing Russia back into any cooperative or constructive diplomatic process toward resolution of these conflicts that would meet any minimum requirement that the Georgians would have? So I wonder if either of you would like to address that.
Well, I mean, I had Georgia in mind when I talked about the perception on the part of the Georgians that somehow the United States was going to be there to defend them no matter what. And I think what happened in 2008 was a real tragedy. And I have, personally, I'm just, you know, I'm conflicted between the desire to do what we've done for all of these countries, which is everything possible to maintain their independence and territorial integrity, and being seen as not being able to deliver security to a country that we have said we will watch out for. I think, you know, if I were worried about conflict breaking out, I would worry more about Georgia-Russia again than I would almost Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think part of the reason for the shift in Russian policy that you described, Molly, quite frankly, relates to U.S. policy toward Kosovo. Because once we, and I was part of that process too, you know, once the United States said Kosovo has the right to self-determination and independence, we set a precedent that was very helpful to the Russians to be able to say, well, why, you know, you're going around trying to get people to recognize Kosovo. What's wrong with us going around trying to get people to recognize the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia? So we are not entirely without some blame here. But I just see the Georgian situation as far more fragile and far more threatening to stability and peace in the region.
I have a little bit different take here. I think one of the most dangerous moments in big historical shifts is when large multinational and multi-ethnic, multi-confessional empires break into smaller states, and the principle for the organization of those states changes. And we all saw, as the 80s were coming to a close, that there was a great danger that the Soviet Union would fall apart in a convulsion of violence. Well, there was violence. There was some violence. The worst of it was in Karabakh, where about 25,000 victims were claimed, plus refugees. There was violence also in the two conflicts in Georgia, and very little, but some violence in Moldova. The Western world thought it was great at that time to let the OSCE, with its rule of consensus, everybody at the table, lightly staffed, let them deal with the four unresolved problems in the former Soviet Union. But when it came to what we now call the former Yugoslavia, that wasn't good enough. We did have OSCE involvement, but we also had the UN in one episode, tragically, and our own efforts there. So I think, in a sense, we were short-sighted in our dealing with these. We sort of said, let the OSCE take care of it. And I agree with you on the Kosovo point. If you look at the timing, if I'm not mistaken, it was about April of 2008, or was it a little earlier?
Well, but the process of
that Kosovo happened. And I remembered, or that we recognized, and we made the strongest possible case for saying this did not set a precedent, but in the minds of many it did set a precedent. And I remember one of the Russian top leaders said one key should fit all locks. That is, if there's a way of solving the problem in Yugoslavia by declaring a state's independence, then that should work for us too. And it was in April 2008 that I believe Mr. Putin started ordering greater involvement with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and it was clear that they wanted to deal with this in a way that would give an answer to the West for Kosovo. Now, skipping to your last point, Rich, you said you were more worried about the situation in Georgia than in Karabakh. I have the opposite view. I'm more worried about Karabakh because I think that tragically what happened in August of 2008 has really frozen for a generation the situation in Georgia. I don't see now, after what happened, that in those short 5 days and thereafter, with the recognition on August 26th, I think it was, by Russia of those two breakaway provinces, I just don't see any realistic hope in the short term for a resolution that would preserve the territorial integrity of Georgia as we have defined it. I mean, one of the great ironies here is that although we fought communism for 60 years, we have decided on the old Bolshevik drawn lines to be the definitive borders in the former Soviet Union. Now, if we think about that we should at least think about it. I mean, now I know there's been a UN resolution on this issue, and the UN resolution did not convey to Abkhazia and South Ossetia the right to secede. But let's remember also that there were autonomy arrangements, including for Nagorno-Karabakh. Those autonomy arrangements in every case were rescinded. And this left, it's a little bit like these Matryoshka dolls. There's always somebody inside who's smaller and doesn't want to be part of the bigger entity. And that's the kind of situation that we're facing in all of these conflicts.
I'm thinking that this might be a good time to go ahead and open up the floor to questions.
Ambassador Evans, you commented that there's always this bigger entity which has a smaller entity which wants independence, and then when it gets independence, then there's a smaller entity within which wants independence on kind of 3 levels of Soviet Union, Georgia, and then its provinces of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So when we look at the history of Europe or the map of Europe, the map of ethnicities in Europe today overlaps with the map of nation states, of boundaries. This is a result of a bloody history in Europe, and now we have peace in Europe after that bloody history. So my question is, do you think that Caucasus or Southeast Europe, Ambassador Kozlaric, for that matter, can go through a different process? Or is it also going to end up sooner or later with changing the borders of the current states to more fit the borders between ethnicities?
That's an excellent question, and there are lots of strands to it, lots of issues here. I don't, by the way, want to say that every situation is really a Matryoshka doll. That was just a shorthand, because there obviously is some limit, and there are many, many differences. One of the reasons for peace generally in Europe today, of course, is a pooling of sovereignty, partial pooling of sovereignty, that has taken place since World War II, because the nations involved realized that they couldn't go on like this, fighting one bloody war every generation. So my short answer and my hope is that the principle of federalism, broadly conceived, offers the best way of squaring the circle, of allowing for regional differences, of bringing government as close as possible to the people, because we've seen over and over again that government which is closest to the people tends to be the best. Government which is distant tends to misunderstand and be slow and so on. So this federal principle is an ancient one. It goes back to the Athenian League, and it's been practiced, of course, I think very successfully in this country. I know when I was trying to mediate the dispute in Moldova, the moment I used the so-called F word, which in this case was federalism, I was crucified because Moldova is a unitary state. But of course, the Transnistrians see it very differently. So that's my quick answer to you. I think that sovereignty is not one and indivisible. There are ways of sharing sovereignty, of pooling sovereignty, and let's hope that the Caucasus and the former Soviet Union will not have to go through the same bloody process that that Europe in general did.
I'm not sure the fix is in with the idea of the nation state. I mean, I think if you look at trends underway in Europe now, they aren't toward, reasserting a centralized nation state, but splitting up. Whether you're looking at the UK, Spain, Belgium, the perpetual poster child for splitting along national lines. The nation state may not be the concept for the future. Maybe you end up with kind of a perversion of, de Gaulle, when France first joined then the European community, talked about l'Europe des patries, the Europe of nation states. And Jacques Delors, in a totally different context, when he was head of the EU, talked about a Europe of regions. And maybe a better way of thinking about this, because when you talk about nation state, it all gets down to land, and land is caught up into, why is this your land when it was 5 centuries ago, my ancestors' land. Somehow you got to break the mold so that you can look at what you want to achieve for the people of that you're concerned about, but to do it in a broader framework than the nation state, because it really, in the Balkans and the Caucasus, it hasn't really helped us that much. And if we approach these problems on the basis of, some sort of nation statehood, we're going to end up with this kind of perpetual diminution of the concept of what a nation state is. What I think the greatest tragedy is the loss of recognition of people of different ethnic groups who historically have lived together, if not married and gone to school and worked together, now looking at each other as the other. And it doesn't make any difference if you're talking about old folks who fought in the wars in the Balkans, or young people your age who are just now coming into positions of influence, where they don't know what the other was except through the prism of war. So you gotta, I think we're at a point where we almost have to break the model if we're going to succeed.
I'd like to look into the future. We talked about history and everything, and more specifically about Georgia's aspirations and hopes for NATO membership. First of all, how real do you think this hope is, this aspiration? And secondly, how do you think that will impact the region at large, the South Caucasus, and more specifically the two frozen, not a preferable term, but frozen conflicts of South Ossetia and Abkhazia? And since the title of this talk is Russia as a partner or a spoiler, and yet better a competitor, what do you assume Russia's role would be given the prospects or efforts of Georgia's membership into NATO?
Just as we were saying at the beginning of this session, that the Russian Federation is not what the Soviet Union was, neither is NATO today what NATO was before. Max Kampelman once said to me, what NATO ought to do is change its name and call itself something else, and then the reaction to it in Moscow might be a lot more benign.
I don't think so.
Well, there's a very real question here, too. Armenia very much depends on Russia for its defense. There's a Russian base in Armenia. the bad state of relations between Georgia and Russia means that Russia has difficulty accessing that base. Now, it has been able to do so, but if Georgia were to be a full-fledged member of NATO, would it decrease the security of Armenia? I just asked that question.
Right. I really think it's very unrealistic or unlikely that a country with part of its internationally recognized territory under occupation by a foreign power would be admitted, you know, in that circumstance. So it seems to me that there would have to be resolution of that problem before.
Joshua Noonan from SICE. So how can we expect forward movement in the resolution of the Karabakh problem when both regimes derive stability and legitimacy from the conflict? And how can we overcome this problem?
Not to put too fine a point on it there, that's really putting the question very directly. And I don't know that there's as good an answer as your question. I would fall back on what we've been discussing, that there has to be much more of a public discussion. There has to be continuing high-quality work by the mediators. What has been pointed out by some of our colleagues here in town is that some people in the area now view war as the best way to solve it. Now, if they really think about that and think about the consequences of a war in 2012 or the next couple of years compared to what happened in the early 90s, it would be a completely different kind of war, much more destructive, much more aimed at counter value, that is, at destroying values on the other side. It would be much more of an air war. So I'm not giving you answers as to how we're going to solve it. What I am saying most emphatically is we've got to prevent a resumption of this war because its consequences could be terrible. Let me go one step further and say, if, God forbid, we have a hot war with Iran, and you have so-called southern Azerbaijan, which is northwestern Iran, and you have Azerbaijan lined up with Israel, and you have Turkey lining up with Azerbaijan. There's no love lost between Iran and Turkey. Armenia's in the middle. Russia is aligned with Armenia. Georgia might do a number of different things, but is quite close to Turkey. You could have a small war of extremely serious consequence there. Not only the pipeline could be threatened, the nuclear plant at Metsamor could be a target, the two capital cities, the oil fields, bridges, highways, population centers. It could be a disaster. And I think that averting that kind of a disaster is quite a sufficient goal for us right now.
I mean, I think two things that could happen that could change that situation that you've described would be Russia to be, you know, more beyond the rhetorical level, and obviously Medvedev put a lot of effort into the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, but to really make it clear that not only do they want no conflict, but they want to see a peaceful resolution of this. And for Turkish-Armenian reconciliation, which has been, it was a tragedy that opening was stopped the way it was, that be allowed to continue. Because those are the kinds of things, if you're looking for externals, those are the two countries that I think would have the most impact on the parties to change what I agree with you is the situation that if we just do the Minsk group as we've done it for 20 years, this is where we're going to be.
I would like to draw the discussion to a close. I think it's been a fascinating one. I would just observe that it seems like rather than being a confrontation between two really dramatically opposed views, we found a lot of common grounds between our two speakers, especially with respect to the nuanced view of how Russia could be something between a partner and a spoiler. Before we close completely, I would just like to ask if either of you would like to make a brief closing statement, just to sort of sum up what we've talked about, or do you think, anyway, if you'd like to, I'd invite you to do that.
Well, I'd just like to, thank you, Molly, and again, the audience for making this a very, very interesting event. The one issue that we really didn't touch on directly, which I think is behind a lot of what John and I have been saying about what's going on internally in Armenia and Azerbaijan, is the whole question of democratic development, respect for human rights, and freedom of the media. If you're going to reach a settlement on something as sensitive as NK, there must be a free opposition, a free media, and a free opportunity for people to speak out about how this conflict can be resolved. That is not happening in Azerbaijan. I'm not sure what Armenia is like, but there's an internal process that really has to go along in addition to whatever else is working through the Minsk group and through other mechanisms between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
I'd just like to sum up by saying, or asking some questions about us, us meaning the Americans. We are a different kind of nation. We make our foreign policy with differing ingredients, realism and idealism, and sometimes we look at, just to pick somebody out of the blue, we look at Mr. Putin in Russia, and we think, oh, we don't like him. He's not our kind of guy. He's sort of, he's sort of sour, and, he used to be in the KGB and so on. And so we sort of decide that we shouldn't necessarily deal with these people. And that's, I think we've got to get over that, because there are lots of people around the world who have a different view. I'm not saying at all that there is no evil in the world. I'm not saying that there aren't great differences. There are huge differences. It's a facile sort of Girl Scout thing to say that the people everywhere are the same. It's just not true. There are some basics that are the same for all of us. But as Heidegger once put it, we all look into the world through a different clearing, and we see it from a different angle. And so it seems to me that we've got to realize that the line between good and evil, as one Russian proverb has it, it goes through every human heart. It's not that there's an axis of evil and the rest of us are all good. There are these complex mixtures, and we've got to be sophisticated enough, including through our knowledge of history, to deal with all that.
I'd like to thank you all for asking such good questions, and to ask you to join us at the reception just now, and to join me now in thanking our two distinguished
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.